The airport was alive with its usual chaos, a familiar symphony of hurried footsteps, rolling luggage, and half-distracted conversations. Travelers darted between gates, clutching boarding passes and coffee cups, their faces a mixture of excitement, exhaustion, and impatience. Overhead, the crackling voice of an announcer struggled to be heard, reminding passengers to proceed to their gates. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of jet fuel drifting in from the tarmac. Amid the commotion, a man sat quietly in the corner of a bustling cafe. He was a study in calm, leaning slightly forward, his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. His clothes were simple, almost forgettable, a faded gray hoodie, dark jeans, and sneakers that had clearly seen better days. At his feet rested a small, worn duffel bag, its frayed edges hinting at years of travel. Nobody gave him a second glance. He was just another anonymous traveler blending into the background of a busy airport, the kind of person you'd pass by without noticing. And that seemed to suit him just fine. But if someone had taken the time to look closer, they might have noticed there was something different about him. It wasn't obvious, not at first. His face was calm, almost expressionless, but his eyes told a different story. They were sharp, constantly moving, not in a nervous or restless way, but with purpose, like they were cataloging everything around him. The clinking of a spoon against a cup. The couple arguing softly 2 tables away. The security guard leaning against the wall by the entrance. Nothing escaped his notice. Even the way he sat seemed intentional, as if his body had been trained to remain perfectly still but ready to move at a moment's notice. He didn't fidget or slouch. His back was straight, his shoulders relaxed, his posture radiating a quiet confidence that wasn't immediately obvious. If someone had been paying attention, they might have wondered, who is this man? But no one did. The cafe was packed with travelers who had other things on their minds. A businesswoman in a sharp suit was furiously typing on her laptop, her brow furrowed in concentration. A teenager with headphones was scrolling through his phone, a bored expression on his face. A family of 4 was trying to keep their 2 young children entertained while balancing bags and snacks. Everyone was wrapped up in their own little world, too busy to notice the quiet man in the corner. And that was just how he liked it. The man took another sip of his coffee, his expression never changing. He glanced at the large digital clock mounted on the wall. The numbers glowed bright red, 2:45 p.m. His flight wasn't for another 2 hours. Plenty of time to sit, watch, and wait. But as calm as he appeared, there was an air of quiet intensity about him, like a storm waiting to break. It wasn't something you could put your finger on, but it was there, a subtle tension that set him apart from the other travelers. This wasn't someone killing time before a vacation or a business trip. This was someone with a purpose. Someone who had seen and done things that most people couldn't imagine. Someone who knew how to disappear into a crowd when it suited him and how to take control of a situation when it didn't. But for now, he was just another face in the crowd. And then, they arrived. The first thing you noticed was the sound, the heavy thud of boots on polished tile, the low rumble of voices that carried over the hum of the cafe. Heads turned, conversations paused. 3 men walked into the cafe, and they made sure everyone knew it. They were hard to miss, clad in leather jackets covered with patches and skull emblems, ripped jeans, and chains that clinked with every step. Their presence was loud, even if they hadn't spoken yet. The tallest of the 3, with a shaved head and a jagged scar running down his cheek, led the way. He moved with the swagger of someone who believed he was untouchable. The other 2 weren't far behind. One was stocky and broad-shouldered, his thick arms covered in faded tattoos. The third was wiry, with a sharp, angular face and a smirk that never quite left his lips. They looked like they belonged in a biker bar, not an airport cafe. The tall one barked out a laugh as they approached the counter, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "What's a guy gotta do to get a decent coffee around here?" he joked loudly, nudging one of his companions. The barista, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, smiled nervously as she handed him his order. "Here you go, sir." "Sir," he repeated mockingly, grinning as he leaned closer. "You hear that, boys? She called me sir." His companions chuckled, their laughter low and menacing. As they moved away from the counter, their eyes scanned the room, looking for their next target. It didn't take long. The quiet man in the corner hadn't moved. He kept his eyes on his coffee, his expression unreadable. But his stillness seemed to draw their attention like a magnet. "Hey, look at this guy," the wiry one said, nodding toward the man. "Sitting all by himself. Think he's waiting for his mommy to pick him up." The tall one grinned, his eyes narrowing. "Nah, he's too old for that. Maybe he's just lonely." They made their way toward him, their footsteps deliberate, their voices getting louder. But the man didn't react. He took another sip of his coffee, as if he hadn't noticed them at all. The bikers stopped a few feet away, their towering frames casting shadows over his small table. "Hey, buddy," the tall one said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You look like you could use some company." Still, the man didn't look up. "Not much of a talker, huh?" the stocky one added, crossing his arms. "What's in the bag?" The man finally raised his head, his calm eyes meeting theirs. For a moment, the cafe seemed to hold its breath. "Just clothes," he said simply, his voice steady. The tall one chuckled, leaning closer. "Clothes, huh? Mind if we take a look?" The man's gaze didn't waver. "I'd rather you didn't." His words were soft, almost polite. But there was something in his tone that gave even the bikers pause, something that suggested this quiet man might not be as ordinary as he seemed. For a brief moment, the air was thick with tension. And then, the tall one reached for the bag. The man's fingers tightened slightly around the cup in his hands. The motion was so small, so precise, that it was almost unnoticeable. "Almost." "I said," the man repeated, his tone firm but still polite, "I'd rather you didn't." The tall biker smirked, clearly amused by what he saw as resistance. "You'd rather I didn't? Well, ain't that polite? What are you gonna do if I decide to take a peek anyway?" The wiry one leaned in, laughing under his breath. "Bet there's nothing in there but some old underwear. Maybe a toothbrush. Real exciting stuff." But the man didn't respond. He didn't flinch, didn't rise to their bait. He simply watched them, his calm gaze unwavering. The stocky biker stepped forward now, his bulk towering over the table. "Come on, man. Let's see what you're hiding," he growled, reaching for the bag. Before his fingers could make contact, the man moved. It wasn't sudden or aggressive, just a simple adjustment, as if he were casually stretching. But in that motion, his hand came to rest on the duffel bag, firmly anchoring it in place. The stocky biker blinked, momentarily thrown off. "I'm going to say it one last time," the man said, his voice low and deliberate. "Leave the bag alone." The room seemed to grow quieter, the surrounding travelers now glancing nervously at the scene unfolding in the corner. No one dared to intervene. The tall biker straightened up, his grin disappearing. "You've got some nerve, buddy," he said, his tone shifting from mockery to something more dangerous. "You think you can tell us what to do? In our airport?" A few scattered laughs erupted from his companions, but the man sitting at the table didn't even blink. He calmly set his coffee cup down, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. "Your airport?" he asked, his tone still calm. There was the faintest hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "I wasn't aware airports belonged to biker gangs now. You guys running TSA these days?" The tall one's face twisted in irritation. "You think you're funny?" "I think," the man replied evenly, that you should find someone else to bother. For a brief moment, the tall biker hesitated. There was something about the man's tone, something about the way he carried himself that gave him pause. But then he laughed, shaking off the feeling. "Well, boys," he said, stepping even closer, "looks like we've got ourselves a tough guy. Let's see how tough he really is." He reached for the bag, his fingers brushing against the worn canvas. And that's when everything changed. The man moved faster than anyone could have anticipated. In a blur of motion, his hand shot out, clamping down on the biker's wrist with a precision that was almost surgical. The biker froze, his mouth opening slightly in shock. "I told you," the man said, his voice still calm, but now carrying an unmistakable edge, "to leave it alone." The tall biker yanked his arm back, but the man's grip was like iron. For a moment, the two of them were locked in a silent standoff, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. The wiry one stepped forward, his smirk faltering. "Hey, man, let him go. We were just messing around." The man's eyes flicked toward him, sharp and assessing. Slowly, deliberately, he released the tall biker's wrist, his fingers uncurling with a controlled precision that was more intimidating than any sudden movement could have been. The tall one stumbled back, cradling his wrist and glaring at the man. "You've got a death wish, you know that." The man didn't respond. He simply picked up his coffee cup again, taking another sip as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. The bikers knew it, and so did everyone else in the cafe. For the first time, the three men seemed unsure of themselves. They exchanged glances, their bravado faltering under the weight of the man's unshakable calm. "You're lucky we're in a public place," the stocky one muttered, his voice low and threatening. The man raised an eyebrow, setting his cup down again. "Am I?" he asked, his tone carrying the faintest hint of amusement. The stocky biker took a step forward, his fists clenching. "Yeah, you are. Because if we weren't, you'd be." "Enough." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone stop. It was the man who had spoken, his tone sharp and commanding. The stocky biker froze, his words dying in his throat. "You're not going to do anything," the man continued, his eyes locking onto the bikers with an intensity that seemed to root him to the spot. "Because you don't want to know what happens if you try." For a moment, no one moved. The cafe seemed to hold its breath, the tension crackling like electricity. And then, the tall biker laughed a short, humorless sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But this ain't over, buddy." He turned on his heel, motioning for his companions to follow. The stocky one lingered for a moment, his fists still clenched, but a sharp glance from the tall one sent him retreating. The three of them stalked out of the cafe, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet space. As soon as they were gone, the air seemed to loosen. Conversations resumed, albeit in hushed tones. The man in the hoodie picked up his bag, adjusting it slightly as he settled back into his seat. Across the room, a young woman whispered to her companion, "Who do you think he is?" Her companion shook his head. "I don't know. But he's not just some regular guy." The man didn't seem to notice or care that he was the center of attention. He simply took another sip of his coffee, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. But those who had witnessed the scene couldn't shake the feeling that they had just seen a glimpse of something extraordinary. And outside, the bikers weren't done. They entered like they owned the place, three men clad in leather jackets and heavy boots, their voices loud enough to make heads turn. Their entrance disrupted the steady hum of conversation in the cafe, replacing it with an uneasy silence. The tallest of them, sporting a crude skull tattoo creeping up his neck, barked at the barista for messing up his order. "I said extra cream, didn't I?" he growled, slamming his hand on the counter. His companions laughed, the sound low and menacing, as if daring anyone to intervene. They had an air about them, a deliberate kind of chaos they carried wherever they went. People glanced at them nervously before quickly looking away, hoping not to draw their attention. The bikers thrived on that fear, feeding off it like vultures on a fresh kill. The skull-tattooed leader grabbed his cup, took a sip, and grimaced dramatically. "What is this garbage? Do you people even know how to make coffee?" he spat, throwing the lid onto the counter. The barista, a young man barely out of his teens, stammered an apology, his hands trembling as he offered to fix the drink. "Forget it," the biker snapped, waving him off. "Not worth my time." The three men turned away from the counter, their eyes scanning the cafe like predators searching for their next target. It didn't take long for their attention to land on him, the quiet man in the corner, sitting alone with his duffel bag at his feet. "Well, look who's trying to disappear," the tallest one sneered, his voice carrying across the room. The quiet man didn't react. He sat there, sipping his coffee as if the commotion had nothing to do with him. This seemed to irritate them. Ignoring someone like them, that was a challenge. They sauntered over, their heavy boots thudding against the tiled floor. The sound seemed louder than it should have, as if even the floor was uneasy about their presence. "Hey, buddy," the leader called out, stopping a few feet from the table. "What's in the bag?" The quiet man finally looked up, his calm eyes meeting the biker's. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even annoyed. If anything, there was a kind of stillness about him, like the calm before a storm. "Just clothes," he said evenly. There was no apology in his tone, no hint of nervousness. It was steady. Controlled. The bikers exchanged glances, their grins widening. This wasn't the reaction they were used to. Most people stuttered, avoided eye contact, or tried to placate them. But this guy? He acted like they were barely worth noticing. "Just clothes, huh?" the wiry one said, leaning in closer. He had a patchy beard and a scar running across his left eyebrow. "Why don't we take a look? See if you're telling the truth." The man didn't move. He didn't tense up or pull the bag closer. He simply kept his gaze on them, calm and unyielding. "I'd rather you didn't," he said, his tone polite but firm. The tallest biker let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head. "You'd rather we didn't? What are you, some kind of comedian?" He leaned over the table, his shadow falling across the man. "Newsflash, buddy, we don't care what you'd rather. Now hand it over." The cafe was deathly silent now. Every pair of eyes was on the scene unfolding in the corner. The barista had frozen mid-step, a tray of coffee wobbling precariously in his hands. A mother whispered urgently to her child, urging them to stay quiet. The man sighed softly, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. "I'm asking you nicely," he said, his voice still calm. "Don't touch the bag." The wiry biker snorted. "Oh, he's asking nicely. Well, I guess we better listen, huh?" The stocky one, who had been silent until now, stepped forward with a smirk. "Or what? What are you gonna do if we don't?" The man's eyes flicked to him, sharp and assessing. There was no anger in his gaze, no fear. Just a quiet confidence that made the stocky biker's grin falter ever so slightly. "You don't want to find out," the man said simply. The tallest biker's grin widened. He reached down, his hand hovering over the duffel bag. "I think we do." The moment his fingers brushed the canvas, everything changed. The man moved so quickly that it took a second for everyone to process what had happened. One moment, the biker was reaching for the bag. The next, his wrist was trapped in an iron grip, the quiet man's hand clamped down with a precision that spoke of years of training. The biker let out a startled grunt, his eyes widening in shock. He tried to pull back, but the man's grip didn't budge. "I told you," the man said, his voice still calm, "to leave it alone." The biker's companions took a step forward, their expressions shifting from amusement to something darker. The wiry one reached for the man's arm, but before he could make contact, the man released the leader's wrist and stood up in one fluid motion. He wasn't a large man, lean, almost wiry, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made him seem taller, more imposing. His movements were deliberate, every step measured and purposeful. "Do you really want to do this?" he asked, his gaze sweeping over the three of them. The tallest biker flexed his wrist, wincing slightly. His smirk was gone now, replaced by a scowl. "You've got a death wish, old man," he growled. "Maybe," the man said, his tone light. "Or maybe I just don't like bullies." The wiry one lunged, his hand reaching for the man's shoulder. But the man sidestepped effortlessly, his movements so smooth it was almost as if he had anticipated the attack before it even happened. The wiry biker stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the table. He spun around, his face twisted in frustration. "You're gonna regret that." The man didn't reply. He simply stood there, his posture relaxed but ready, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. The stocky biker stepped forward now, his fists clenched. "You think you're some kind of tough guy? I think you should walk away," the man said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. For a moment, it seemed like they might. The three bikers exchanged glances, their confidence shaken by the man's unshakable calm. But then the tallest one sneered, shaking his head. "You're gonna wish you'd kept your mouth shut," he snarled. The man's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Maybe," he said softly. "But not today." The leader's snarl was the final cue. The stocky biker clenched his fists and lunged forward, clearly banking on brute force to take down the man who dared stand his ground. His heavy boots pounded against the tiled floor as he charged, but the quiet man didn't flinch. What followed next could only be described as effortless precision. The quiet man sidestepped at the last second, his movements smooth and deliberate. His arm shot out, catching the stocky biker by the forearm, and with a fluid twist, he redirected the momentum. The biker stumbled forward, losing his balance, and crashed into a nearby table with a loud clatter, spilling coffee cups and scattering pastries across the floor. Gasps rippled through the cafe. Someone muttered, "Did you see that?" while others simply stared, wide-eyed and frozen. The leader barked, "Get up, you idiot." His face was flushed, not just with anger but with disbelief. The stocky biker groaned as he pushed himself to his feet, his face contorted with rage. He didn't look at the quiet man, though. Not yet. There was something unnerving about the way his opponent had moved, calm, precise, and completely unfazed. 2-on-1 now, the wiry one growled, stepping up alongside his leader. His hand dipped into his pocket, pulling out a switchblade with a flick. The blade gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. The cafe collectively inhaled. A woman near the window whispered, "Someone call security." Another patron cautiously inched toward the exit, clearly not wanting to stick around for what was about to happen. The quiet man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. His gaze flicked to the blade for the briefest moment before returning to the wiry biker's face. He didn't seem alarmed. If anything, there was a glint of something in his eyes, anticipation, perhaps. "You sure you want to go that route?" he asked, his tone almost conversational. The wiry biker sneered. "Big talk for a guy who's outnumbered." The leader grinned. "Oh, we're doing this." He cracked his knuckles dramatically, stepping forward to join the wiry one. "You don't walk away from us after pulling a stunt like that. Let's see how tough you really are." The quiet man sighed softly, as if disappointed. He glanced briefly at his coffee cup, still sitting on the table. "You know," he said, "I was hoping to finish that before it got cold." That offhand comment seemed to infuriate the bikers even more. They moved as one, the wiry biker lunging low with the knife while the leader aimed a punch toward the man's head. It was over before it even started. The quiet man stepped back, his body moving with a fluidity that seemed almost unreal. His left hand shot out, grabbing the wiry biker's wrist mid-lunge. In one swift motion, he twisted, forcing the biker to drop the knife with a yelp of pain. The blade clattered to the floor, spinning harmlessly away. Before the wiry one could recover, the man pivoted, using his grip on the wrist to pull him forward and off balance. A subtle shift of weight sent the biker sprawling onto his knees, clutching his arm and cursing under his breath. The leader, meanwhile, found his punch met with a quick sidestep and a sharp jab to the ribs. It wasn't a flashy move, but it was effective. The air rushed out of his lungs in a wheeze, and he stumbled back, clutching his side. The quiet man remained standing in the same spot, his posture unchanged. He hadn't even broken a sweat. "You should really listen when people warn you," he said calmly, his gaze flicking between the two bikers still on their feet. The stocky one growled, his face red with humiliation. "You're gonna regret this," he roared, grabbing a chair and swinging it wildly. The quiet man's eyes narrowed slightly, and he moved again, stepping inside the arc of the swing. His hand caught the chair leg mid-motion, and with a firm tug, he ripped it out of the biker's hands. The chair clattered to the floor as he delivered a swift kick to the biker's shin, sending him collapsing to one knee. The leader, still wheezing, tried to recover his composure. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. The quiet man didn't answer. Instead, he took a small step back, his gaze sweeping the cafe. It wasn't just the bikers watching him now. Every patron, every staff member, even the people walking by outside had stopped to stare through the glass. There was a silence that hung in the air, heavy and electric. "Let's just say," the man finally said, his tone quiet but firm, "I've dealt with worse than the three of you." The leader's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his expression now. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the man in front of him wasn't just an ordinary traveler. "You think you're some kind of hero," the wiry biker spat, still clutching his wrist. The quiet man shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "But I don't like bullies." The leader clenched his fists, his pride warring with common sense. He glanced at his companions, one on his knees, one nursing his arm, and the other still struggling to catch his breath. The fight had turned against them faster than he could have imagined. Finally, he let out a frustrated growl and motioned toward the door. "We're done here," he snapped. "Let's go." The wiry biker hesitated, glaring at the quiet man as if considering another move, but the leader barked again, "Now." Reluctantly, the three of them began to retreat, their bravado crumbling under the weight of their defeat. As they reached the door, the leader paused, turning back for one last jab. "You got lucky today, old man. Next time, you won't." The quiet man didn't respond. He simply picked up his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and set it back down. The bikers stormed out, their heavy boots echoing down the corridor. The cafe remained silent for a few more moments, everyone frozen in place as if waiting for the quiet man to say or do something else. Finally, the barista broke the tension, whispering, "What just happened?" A murmur of conversation rippled through the room as people began to piece together what they had just witnessed. Some exchanged nervous glances, others whispered excitedly about the man in the hoodie who had taken on three bikers without breaking a sweat. The quiet man, for his part, simply sat back down, picked up his coffee, and resumed sipping it. "Excuse me, sir," a nervous voice said. He glanced up to see the young barista standing a few feet away, holding a fresh cup of coffee. "On the house," the barista said quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he set it down on the table. The man offered a small, polite nod. "Thank you." As the barista scurried away, Someone else approached a woman in her late 30s, her expression a mix of curiosity and admiration. "That was incredible," she said, her voice hushed. Are you military?" The man hesitated for a moment, his gaze flicking to the door where the bikers had left. He didn't answer her question directly. "Just someone passing through," he said simply. With that, he returned to his coffee, as if nothing had happened. But for everyone else in the cafe, it was clear this man was no ordinary traveler. And whatever his story was, it was far from ordinary. The quiet man took a step back, his movements calm and controlled, yet the tension in the room thickened. Every patron in the cafe seemed to hold their breath, sensing something was about to happen. "You think you're tough, huh?" the stocky biker jeered, stepping closer. His shoulders squared, trying to intimidate. "You gonna teach us a lesson, soldier boy?" The man didn't answer right away. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the bikers, assessing them. It wasn't fear in his gaze, it was something colder, sharper. Like he was calculating every move before it even happened. One of the onlookers, an older man sitting near the counter, couldn't help but speak up. "Maybe you boys should leave him alone," he said, his voice trembling slightly. The tallest biker turned toward him with a scowl. "Mind your business, old man," he barked. The quiet man took a small step forward, drawing the biker's attention back to him. "He's right," he said evenly. "You should walk away while you still can." That sentence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. The wiry biker laughed, a high-pitched, mocking sound. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." He nudged the stocky one. "What do you say we show him what happens to guys with smart mouths?" But as they advanced, the quiet man's body shifted subtly. His stance widened just slightly, his feet planted firmly on the ground. His hands hung loose at his sides, but there was a readiness in his posture that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. The veteran near the window leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's squared up. These guys don't know what they've gotten into." The bikers, oblivious to the warning signs, closed the gap. The tallest one swung first, a wide, clumsy punch aimed at the man's head. What happened next was almost too fast for anyone to process. The quiet man ducked smoothly under the punch, his left hand coming up to deflect the arm. In the same motion, his right elbow shot forward, striking the biker in the ribs with a dull thud. The biker doubled over, gasping, his confidence knocked out of him as quickly as the air from his lungs. The wiry one hesitated for just a second before lunging with a wild jab. The quiet man sidestepped, his movements precise, almost clinical. He grabbed the wiry biker's wrist and twisted it sharply. A loud yelp of pain followed as the wiry one dropped to his knees, clutching his arm. The stocky biker froze, his eyes darting between his fallen companions and the man standing before him. For a moment, it looked like he might back down. But pride and the weight of an audience pushed him forward. He grabbed a chair, lifting it above his head with a roar. The quiet man reacted instantly. He stepped in close, too close for the chair to be brought down effectively. His hands shot up, gripping the chair's legs, and with a quick shove, he sent the stocky biker stumbling backward. The chair clattered to the ground as the biker tripped over his own feet, landing hard on his back. The cafe erupted into murmurs. "Did you see that? Who is this guy?" The leader, still clutching his ribs, glared up at the quiet man. "You've made a big mistake," he spat. "You don't know who you're messing with." The quiet man tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. "You don't know who I am," he replied, his voice as steady as ever. The leader's face twisted with rage. "We're not done," he growled, motioning for the others to get up. The wiry biker staggered to his feet, his hand still cradling his injured wrist. The stocky one lumbered up as well, his face red with embarrassment. They regrouped, standing shoulder to shoulder, glaring at the quiet man like a pack of wolves regrouping after their first failed attack. But the man didn't falter. If anything, he seemed even more composed now, as though this confrontation was nothing more than a warm-up. "You've got 3 seconds to walk away," he said, his voice firm but not angry. "Or what?" the leader shot back. The quiet man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the gap between them. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, like a taut wire ready to snap. Before anyone could say another word, the cafe doors swung open. 2 uniformed security guards rushed in, their radios crackling. "What's going on here?" one of them demanded, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. The bikers immediately stepped back, their bravado deflating slightly in the presence of authority. "He attacked us," the wiry one blurted out, pointing at the quiet man. "We were just minding our business, and he went crazy." The guards glanced around the room, taking in the scene: the overturned chair, the scattered bag, and the faces of the patrons, most of whom looked more amused than alarmed. "Is that true?" one of the guards asked, turning to the quiet man. Before he could respond, the older man by the counter spoke up. "That's not what happened," he said firmly. "These punks started it. He was just defending himself." Other patrons chimed in, nodding and murmuring their agreement. "Yeah, they were harassing him," one woman said. "He didn't do anything wrong." The guards exchanged glances. It was clear whose side the crowd was on. The leader clenched his fists, his face a mask of fury and humiliation. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. The quiet man didn't reply. He simply bent down, picked up his bag, and slung it over his shoulder. "Is there a problem here?" he asked the guards, his tone polite but with an edge of finality. The guards shook their heads. "Just try to avoid any more trouble," one of them said, clearly uncomfortable with addressing the man who had just taken down 3 bikers without breaking a sweat. The bikers grumbled under their breath as they were herded toward the door by the other guard. As they passed the quiet man, the leader leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. "This isn't over." The man didn't react. He simply watched as the bikers disappeared through the doors, their retreat followed by a collective sigh of relief from the cafe patrons. The barista hesitated before stepping forward, her hands trembling slightly as she held out a fresh cup of coffee. Here," she said. "It's on the house." The man accepted the cup with a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly, taking a seat as though nothing had happened. But for everyone else in the room, it was clear this man was no ordinary traveler. Whatever his story was, it was far from over. The quiet man sat back down, his demeanor unchanged. He took a slow sip of his coffee, the steam curling around his face as if nothing unusual had occurred. The hum of conversation in the cafe started to return, but now it carried a different tone: curiosity, speculation, and admiration. "He took down 3 guys like it was nothing," someone whispered. "That tattoo, he's military, isn't he?" another voice chimed in. The older veteran who had recognized the tattoo earlier shook his head, a slight grin tugging at his lips. "Not just military," he muttered, almost to himself. "That guy's a professional. You don't move like that unless you've been trained for something serious." Despite the murmurs and stares, the man remained quiet, seemingly uninterested in the attention he'd garnered. He picked up the book from his bag and flipped it open, his eyes scanning the pages as if he were completely absorbed. But anyone watching closely would notice his subtle glances toward the door, his peripheral vision catching every movement. He wasn't relaxing, he was waiting. Outside the cafe, the bikers were fuming. The leader, still clutching his side, slammed his fist against the wall. "I'm not letting this slide," he growled. "Nobody humiliates us like that." The wiry one, still nursing his twisted wrist, winced. "He's not normal," Man. Did you see the way he moved? That guy's dangerous. I don't care what he is, the leader snapped. We've got a reputation to protect. If word gets out that some random guy at the airport took us down, we're done for. The stocky biker nodded, his face flushed with anger. We'll wait for him. He's gotta leave the cafe eventually. We'll catch him when he's alone. The wiry one hesitated but eventually nodded, fear of the leader outweighing his common sense. Together, they moved to a corner of the terminal, keeping their eyes on the cafe entrance like wolves stalking prey. Back inside, the man's coffee sat untouched now. Though his eyes stayed on the book, he hadn't turned a page in minutes. His breathing remained steady, but there was a subtle tension in his posture, like a coiled spring waiting to be released. The veteran finally stood, grabbing his cane as he walked toward the man. Mind if I join you? He asked, his voice steady but cautious. The man glanced up, his eyes flicking to the veteran's face before nodding once. Go ahead. The veteran sat down with a small grunt, resting his cane against the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The veteran studied the man, his keen eyes taking in the scars peeking out from beneath the hoodie's cuffs, the precise way he carried himself. Marine Corps, the veteran asked finally, his voice low. The man didn't look surprised at the question. Once, he replied simply. Special Ops, the veteran pressed. The man's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. Something like that. The veteran leaned back in his chair, nodding. Figured as much. I was Army back in the day. Saw a few guys like you. Quiet, calculating. Always a step ahead of the rest of us. The man's gaze softened slightly. Appreciate your service, he said quietly. Likewise, the veteran replied. He hesitated before continuing. Listen, I don't mean to pry, but those bikers. They're not the kind to let this go. You know that, right? The man nodded, his expression unreadable. I know. You got back up? The veteran asked, glancing around the room as if expecting a team of similarly trained individuals to materialize. The man shook his head. Don't need it? The veteran chuckled softly. I believe you. Just, be careful. The world's full of people who don't know when to quit. The man nodded again, his gratitude clear in his eyes even if his words were sparse. Thanks. The veteran stood, gripping his cane tightly. If you need anything, I'll be over there. He gestured to his seat by the window. The man watched him go, his respect evident. But the moment the veteran was seated, the man's attention shifted back to the door. Outside, the bikers were growing impatient. How long's he gonna sit in there? The wiry one muttered, glancing nervously over his shoulder as if the airport security might appear at any moment. As long as it takes, the leader snapped. He's not staying in that cafe forever. The stocky one cracked his knuckles. When he comes out, we hit him hard and fast. None of that one-on-one stuff. We take him down together. Yeah, the wiry one said, though his voice lacked conviction. Together. The quiet man eventually closed his book, tucking it back into his bag. He stood, his movements unhurried but deliberate, and adjusted the strap of his duffel. As he headed toward the door, the cafe patrons watched him go, some whispering among themselves, others simply staring. The veteran gave him a small nod as he passed, a silent acknowledgement between two men who understood more than they said. The man stepped out into the bustling terminal, his expression calm but his eyes alert. He knew they were waiting for him. He could feel their presence like a storm on the horizon. And sure enough, there they were leaning casually against a pillar, trying to blend in but failing miserably. Their eyes lit up the moment they saw him. There he is, the leader growled, straightening. Let's go. The man didn't alter his pace. He walked with steady confidence, his bag slung over one shoulder, his free hand relaxed at his side. But his mind was working at lightning speed, calculating every possibility, every angle. The bikers fell into step behind him, their heavy boots clomping against the polished floor. Other travelers gave them a wide berth, sensing the tension radiating from the group. "Hey, tough guy," the leader called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Where you headed in such a hurry?" The man didn't answer. He kept walking, his focus narrowing on a quieter part of the terminal ahead. Less crowded. Fewer witnesses. "Don't ignore me," the leader barked, his voice louder now. "You think you can just walk away after what you did?" The man finally stopped. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting the leader's with a calm intensity that made the biker hesitate for just a second. "You're making a mistake," the man said, his voice low but firm. The stocky biker stepped forward, cracking his knuckles again. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can get away with embarrassing us." The wiry one, still cradling his wrist, hung back, his eyes darting nervously between his companions and the quiet man. The man dropped his bag to the floor, his movements deliberate. He straightened, his stance subtly shifting into something more solid, more prepared. "You've got one chance to walk away," he said, his voice steady. "Take it." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're outnumbered, buddy. We're not going anywhere." The quiet man's eyes flicked to each of them, assessing, calculating. His body was still, but there was an unmistakable energy in his posture, a readiness that made the air around them feel electric. The bikers charged. The cafe was silent again, every pair of eyes glued to the man standing in the middle of the room. He calmly adjusted his hoodie, his breathing steady as if the encounter had barely fazed him. The bikers disappeared into the crowd, their heavy boots fading into the distance. The man bent down, picked up his duffel bag, and slung it over his shoulder. He turned toward the veteran seated by the window, who nodded in quiet respect. Without a word, the man exited the cafe and walked into the bustling terminal, the crowd parting instinctively to let him through. But the bikers weren't gone for long. Outside in the parking lot, they regrouped near their motorcycles, their humiliation burning hotter than their injuries. The leader paced back and forth, his face twisted in fury. "We can't let him get away with that," he spat, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. The wiry one shook his head, cradling his injured wrist. "I'm telling you, boss, that guy's not normal. He's trained." "Trained or not," the leader growled, "he's just one guy. We'll handle him together, this time for real. No messing around." The stocky biker nodded, his face still red from his earlier embarrassment. "Yeah, we'll hit him hard. Make sure he knows who's in charge." The wiry one hesitated, glancing nervously toward the terminal. "What if he's not just some random guy? What if he's, like, military or something?" The leader snorted. "Military? Yeah, right. He's just some punk who got lucky. And if he's not? Well, then we're gonna find out what makes him tick." The bikers climbed onto their motorcycles, revving their engines loudly enough to draw attention from the people walking by. They waited, watching the terminal doors like predators waiting for their prey to emerge. The man moved through the airport with purpose, his eyes scanning every corner. He wasn't running, but he wasn't lingering either. He knew the bikers weren't done. Men like that never let things go, especially when their pride was on the line. He passed through the crowds, weaving between families, business travelers, and flight attendants. He spotted the security checkpoint ahead and slowed down, glancing over his shoulder. He wasn't surprised to see the bikers standing near the glass exit doors, their eyes locked on him. They weren't subtle. They didn't need to be. He sighed and adjusted his bag, stepping out of the flow of passengers. If they wanted a fight, it was better to handle it outside, away from civilians. He walked toward the exit, his steps measured and deliberate. As soon as he stepped outside, the bikers surrounded him. Their motorcycles rumbled ominously, forming a semicircle around him. The leader dismounted first, followed by the stocky one and the wiry one, who looked less enthusiastic but stayed close behind. "Thought you could just walk away, huh?" the leader sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Nobody embarrasses us and gets away with it." The man dropped his duffel bag to the ground and looked at each of them in turn. His gaze wasn't angry or fearful, it was calm, calculating. "I gave you a chance to walk away," he said evenly. "You should have taken it." The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed in the parking lot. "Big talk for someone outnumbered." The man took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "You think numbers matter?" he asked, his voice low. "You're about to find out they don't." The bikers charged as one, their confidence bolstered by their combined strength. But the man didn't flinch. He moved with the kind of precision that came from years of practice, his body a blur of motion. The leader threw a punch, but the man ducked and countered with a quick strike to the ribs that sent him staggering backward. The stocky biker lunged, but the man sidestepped, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back in one smooth motion. The wiry one hesitated again, his fear finally outweighing his loyalty. The leader roared in frustration and came at him again, swinging wildly. The man blocked each strike with ease, his movements efficient and controlled. With a quick sweep of his leg, he knocked the leader off balance, sending him crashing to the ground. The stocky biker tried to break free, but the man's grip was like iron. He pushed him forward, using his own momentum to send him stumbling into a parked motorcycle. The wiry one turned to run, but the man was faster. In 2 strides, he caught up and grabbed him by the collar, pulling him back. "Enough," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. The wiry biker froze, his eyes wide with fear. The man released him, shoving him toward the others. The leader struggled to his feet, clutching his side and glaring at the man. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. The man didn't answer right away. He reached down and picked up his duffel bag, slinging it over his shoulder. Then, he turned to face them, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to know who I am," he said quietly. He pulled out a small item from his bag and tossed it onto the ground in front of them. It was his military dog tags, gleaming under the harsh parking lot lights. The bikers stared at the tags, realization dawning on their faces. The leader's bravado evaporated, replaced by a pale, stunned expression. You're military," he stammered. The man stepped closer, his eyes locking onto the leader's. "I was," he said simply. "And I don't like bullies." The leader swallowed hard, his earlier confidence completely shattered. He gestured to his companions, and they scrambled to their motorcycles, their hands shaking as they fumbled with the keys. "This isn't over," the leader muttered as he climbed onto his bike, though his voice lacked conviction. The man tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. "It is if you're smart." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They roared out of the parking lot, their motorcycles disappearing into the night. As the rumble of the engines faded, the man stood alone in the parking lot. He bent down and picked up his dog tags, tucking them back into his bag. For a moment, he simply stood there, his gaze distant, as if he were replaying something in his mind. The veteran from the cafe appeared at the entrance, his cane tapping softly against the pavement. He walked over slowly, his expression a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "You handled that well," he said, his voice breaking the silence. The man looked up, his calm demeanor returning. "Didn't have much of a choice." The veteran nodded, studying him carefully. "You're more than just a Marine, aren't you?" The man didn't answer right away. He glanced down at the dog tags in his hand before slipping them back into his pocket. "I've been a lot of things," he said quietly. The veteran smiled faintly. "Well, whatever you've been, you did the right thing tonight. Those guys needed a lesson." The man gave a small nod, his eyes meeting the veteran's. "Sometimes people like that only understand one kind of message." The veteran extended his hand. "Name's Carter, by the way. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm around." The man hesitated before shaking his hand. "John." "Good to meet you, John," Carter said. "Take care of yourself." "You too," John replied. As Carter walked away, John adjusted his bag and headed toward the terminal. The night wasn't over, and his flight was still waiting. But as he disappeared into the crowd, the story he left behind lingered in the air, a quiet reminder that real strength isn't loud or flashy. It's steady, unyielding, and always ready when it's needed most. The parking lot fell quiet again, the tension in the air slowly dissipating as the bikers disappeared into the night. John lingered for a moment, his sharp eyes scanning the horizon, ensuring the threat was truly gone. He wasn't one to leave loose ends, and his experience taught him that people like those bikers didn't always retreat for good. Once satisfied, he turned back toward the terminal. Inside the airport, the atmosphere felt different. Word had already spread. People whispered as John walked past, some glancing at him with a mix of awe and curiosity. The barista from the cafe gave him a thumbs up, and a small group of passengers clapped softly as he walked by. John nodded in acknowledgement but didn't stop. Praise wasn't why he acted, it never had been. He found a quiet corner near Gate 12, dropped his duffel bag onto the floor, and sat down. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of delayed flights and last-minute gate changes, but John remained still, his mind elsewhere. His calm demeanor masked the wheels turning in his head. He was replaying the encounter, not for regret but for clarity. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with people like those bikers, and it wouldn't be the last. But something about this situation nagged at him. They weren't just ordinary bullies, and their persistence hinted at something more. Was it pride, or was there a deeper motivation? John had spent enough time in hostile situations to know when there was more to a story. Meanwhile, outside the airport, the bikers regrouped at a gas station a few miles down the road. Their leader, still nursing his ribs, paced back and forth like a caged animal. "That guy's not just some random traveler," he muttered, slamming his fist against a vending machine. "He's military. Maybe special forces." The wiry biker sat on a curb, rubbing his bruised collarbone. "We shouldn't mess with him again, boss. He's dangerous." "Shut up," the leader snapped. "He humiliated us. You think I'm just gonna let that slide? We'll find him, and this time we'll be ready." The stocky biker, who had been silent until now, chimed in. "How do we even know where he's going?" The leader smirked, pulling a crumpled boarding pass from his pocket. He had swiped it from John's bag during the scuffle, though John clearly hadn't noticed. "We don't need to know where he's going," the leader said, holding up the pass. "We just need to know where he'll be next." The wiry biker frowned. "You sure about this, boss? I mean, he already took us down once." The leader's smirk faded into a scowl. "This time, we're not going in blind. We'll be ready. And he'll regret ever crossing us." Back at the airport, John's name crackled over the intercom, announcing the boarding of his flight. He stood, grabbing his bag and heading toward the gate. He noticed the whispers around him had quieted, people were still watching, but they were careful not to stare too long. It was better that way. The flight was uneventful, just the way John liked it. He spent most of the journey staring out the window, his mind alternating between the bikers and the mission he was heading toward. Though he was officially retired, his skills and expertise were still in demand. This trip wasn't about vacations or family visits, it was business. Quiet, critical, and off the record. By the time the plane landed, John had almost put the bikers out of his mind. Almost. As he stepped off the plane and into the next terminal, the familiar hum of airport life greeted him. He adjusted his duffel bag and began moving toward the exit, blending into the crowd as he always did. But as he approached the baggage claim area, a chill ran down his spine. He spotted them immediately. The bikers. They were lurking near the carousel, trying and failing to blend in. The leader leaned casually against a pillar, his eyes scanning the crowd. The stocky one stood near the exit, arms crossed, while the wiry one pretended to check his phone. They weren't subtle, and they certainly weren't smart. John kept walking, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. Inside, though, his instincts were firing. They had followed him. That meant they weren't just angry, they were determined. And determined men with bruised egos were dangerous. The bikers spotted him as he passed by, their eyes narrowing. The leader pushed off the pillar, signaling subtly to the others. They began to close in, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. John didn't quicken his pace or look back. He let them think they had the upper hand. He moved toward a side corridor leading to a maintenance area less crowded, fewer witnesses. If they wanted a confrontation, he'd make sure it happened on his terms. As soon as he turned the corner, he dropped his duffel bag and waited. His back was to the wall, his senses tuned to every sound. He heard their footsteps long before they came into view. The leader appeared first, his cocky smirk firmly in place. "Thought you could lose us, huh?" he said, his voice echoing in the narrow corridor. The stocky biker and the wiry one flanked him, their faces set with grim determination. The leader gestured to his crew. "Close the exits. Nobody's coming to save him this time." John tilted his head slightly, his calm gaze fixed on the leader. "You came all this way for a rematch?" The leader grinned, cracking his knuckles. "Something like that. You embarrassed us back there. Time to return the favor." John sighed, shaking his head. "I warned you once. This won't end the way you think it will." The leader's grin faltered, just for a moment. But he shook it off, lunging forward with a wild swing. This time, John didn't hold back. His movements were a symphony of precision and power, honed over years of training and real-world experience. He sidestepped the leader's punch and countered with a lightning-fast strike to the solar plexus. The leader crumpled, gasping for air, but John didn't stop. The stocky biker charged, his massive frame barreling toward John like a freight train. John waited until the last possible second before pivoting, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. The wiry one hesitated, clearly torn between loyalty and self-preservation. John turned to him, his expression as calm as ever. "You don't have to do this." The wiry biker dropped his hands, taking a step back. "I'm out," he muttered, turning and running down the corridor without a backward glance. The leader, still struggling to breathe, glared up at John. "You think you're better than us," he wheezed. John crouched down, meeting his gaze. "This was never about being better. It's about knowing when to stop." The leader stared at him, hate and fear warring in his eyes. John stood and stepped over him, picking up his duffel bag and walking away. He didn't look back. By the time airport security arrived, the bikers were gone, dragging their bruised egos and battered bodies with them. John disappeared into the crowd once again, his presence as fleeting as a shadow. But for those who had witnessed the events unfold, one thing was clear: he wasn't just a man. He was a force, quiet and unstoppable, and he had left an indelible mark on everyone he encountered. As the bikers disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the faint roar of their motorcycles, the atmosphere in the cafe began to shift. The tension that had gripped the room like a vice melted away, replaced by a palpable sense of relief. Slowly, a murmur of voices swelled, and then, as if someone flipped a switch, Applause broke out. It wasn't loud or overly dramatic, just a genuine outpouring of gratitude and admiration from the onlookers. The man stood still for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't one for theatrics, and the attention visibly unsettled him. But there was no hostility in the faces turned toward him now, only respect and quiet appreciation. He knelt down, carefully picking up his scattered belongings. The book, slightly bent at the corners, went back into the bag first. Then the neatly folded clothes, and finally, his dog tags, which he slipped into his pocket this time. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he were trying to shrink back into the quiet anonymity he had walked in with. As he zipped up his duffel bag, a man in his late 60s approached him. The older man had a weathered face and sharp eyes that carried the weight of years of experience. He was the same veteran who had earlier whispered about the Marine Corps tattoo. Now, he stepped forward with purpose, extending a hand. "Thank you for your service," the veteran said, his voice steady but warm. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking the handshake. His grip was firm but not overbearing. "Just doing what needed to be done," he replied softly, his tone free of bravado. The older man studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if they had reached an unspoken understanding. "Semper Fi," he ventured, his voice just above a whisper. The man's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Semper Fi," he confirmed, the two words carrying a depth of meaning only they understood. The man slung his bag over his shoulder, preparing to leave. But as he made his way toward the exit, a young woman, the same barista who had been at the mercy of the bikers' harassment, stepped forward. Her hands were trembling, but her expression was resolute. "Wait," she called out, her voice shaky but determined. He paused, turning back to her. She took a hesitant step forward, clutching something in her hands. It was a paper cup, hastily scribbled with the word thanks and a small smiley face. She offered it to him, her cheeks flushed with both gratitude and nervousness. "For the road," she said, her voice breaking slightly. I just wanted to say, thank you. For standing up for me. For all of us." The man's eyes softened. He took the cup gently, nodding his thanks. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice low but kind. As he walked out of the cafe, the barista stood frozen, her heart pounding. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. The parking lot was quiet now, bathed in the soft glow of overhead lights. The man walked to a lone bench near the edge of the lot and sat down. He sipped the coffee the barista had given him, the warmth of the cup grounding him in the moment. He wasn't one to dwell on gratitude or heroics, his actions had never been about recognition. But tonight felt different. For years, he had moved through life in the shadows, his skills honed for battles most people would never see. He had walked away from the military not because he wanted to but because the weight of his missions had begun to carve pieces out of his soul. Now, he tried to live quietly, blending into crowds, avoiding conflict whenever possible. But moments like tonight reminded him that sometimes, action was unavoidable. His mind drifted back to the bikers. They had been careless, reckless, and arrogant. But more importantly, they had underestimated him, a mistake too many people made. He wasn't a man who sought fights, but he finished them when he had to. He hoped they had learned their lesson tonight. If not, well, he would be ready. He always was. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the bikers regrouped at a dimly lit garage on the outskirts of town. The leader, nursing a bruised arm and an even more bruised ego, paced back and forth while his companions sat in sullen silence. The wiry one muttered something under his breath, earning a sharp glare from the leader. "We're not letting this go," the leader growled. "Nobody makes fools out of us." But his words rang hollow. Even he couldn't deny the sheer skill and power the man had displayed. Every move had been calculated, every strike precise. Whoever he was, he wasn't someone they could take on. Not without consequences. For the first time, doubt began to creep into the leader's mind. Maybe it was time to let this one go. Back at the airport, the man boarded his flight, the duffel bag now securely by his side. He slipped into his seat near the back of the plane, blending effortlessly into the crowd of travelers. By the time the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground, he had already vanished from the minds of most of the passengers. But not from everyone. The cafe staff spent the rest of the evening talking about the mysterious man who had stood up to the bikers. The barista, in particular, couldn't shake the image of him from her mind. There was something about the way he had carried himself, calm, controlled, yet undeniably powerful. She found herself wondering who he really was, what his story might be. "I don't know who he was," the veteran finally said, breaking into the conversation, "but I'll tell you one thing, he's not someone you cross. Men like him, they're made of something different." The barista nodded, her heart still pounding. She didn't know his name, but she knew one thing for certain, she would never forget him. As the plane soared through the night sky, the man leaned back in his seat, his eyes closing for what felt like the first time in days. He wasn't a hero, not in the way people thought. He was just a man trying to live his life, using the skills he had when the situation called for them. But as sleep began to overtake him, one thought lingered in his mind: sometimes, justice wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping change. Sometimes, it was about the small moments, the quiet victories that reminded people the world wasn't as dark as it seemed. And for tonight, that was enough. Sometimes, it's the quietest person in the room who carries the loudest story. We all know the type, the ones who don't shout, don't demand attention, who sit in the corner while life whirls around them. We look at them and think they're just ordinary. Maybe they're shy. Maybe they're trying to blend in, or maybe they're just waiting for something. But what if the truth is that they are more than ordinary? What if they've lived lives far beyond what any of us could imagine? Lives filled with battles fought, challenges overcome, and experiences that shaped them into someone capable of handling the world's toughest moments without ever saying a word. It's easy to overlook the quiet ones. The world often praises the loud, the outspoken, the ones who demand the spotlight. But true strength doesn't come from the noise you make. It doesn't come from how many people know your name or how much attention you grab. True strength is in the moments when no one's looking. It's in the quiet, steady steps taken when you know no one is watching, when you're faced with a challenge that requires more than just talk. Take a moment to think about the things that really matter. The times when you've had to stand firm, even when everything around you was falling apart. It wasn't the loudest voices in the room that kept you going. It was the strength inside you, the quiet resolve that whispered, "You can do this. Just keep moving." That's the kind of strength that doesn't need to be seen to be real. That's the kind of strength that gets people through the darkest of days. It doesn't matter how many obstacles you face, or how many times people underestimate you. It's how you handle them when it counts. It's not about how fast you move or how loudly you speak, it's about how steady you stand when the world expects you to fall. Like the quiet man at the airport, who didn't fight because he wanted to, but because it was right. He didn't make a scene or call attention to himself. He simply did what had to be done, in the calmest, most effective way possible. And in doing so, he reminded everyone in that room without saying a word that strength doesn't need to announce itself. Sometimes, the world needs a reminder. We forget that courage doesn't always come with a roar. It's in the moments when you face down fear, when you stand tall in the face of adversity, when you speak softly but firmly, and when you show up, not for recognition, but because something inside you tells you it's the right thing to do. There are days when everything feels like it's falling apart. Days when you wonder if it's even worth trying anymore. But then something happens. Maybe it's a quiet act of kindness, or a moment of grace from someone you never expected. Maybe it's the simple knowledge that you've done all you can. And in that moment, you find your strength again. You stand a little taller. You breathe a little easier. And you realize that no matter what's going on around you, you are still in control. You are still standing. For every person who feels invisible or overlooked, remember that your worth is not determined by the attention you get. It's not about how loud your voice is. It's about how you show up when it matters. It's about the quiet moments of courage that no one sees but everyone feels. The strength you carry is not in your words, but in your actions. And sometimes, the most powerful action is simply standing strong and letting the world figure out that you've always been more than it realized. The world can be chaotic. It can be unfair and loud. But in those moments, the quiet ones like the man at the cafe remind us that we don't need to shout to be heard. We don't need to show off to be powerful. We just need to be steady. We need to stand tall when it matters most. And when we do, that quiet strength can change the world around us in ways no one could ever predict. So, next time you find yourself doubting your place in the world, remember this: true strength is not about how many people notice you or how loud you are. It's about being there, being steady, and doing what needs to be done, no matter what. It's about knowing that you don't need to prove yourself to anyone. The most powerful thing you can do is show up and stand strong, because that's when you make the biggest impact. That's when your story is heard, even without saying a word.